right. So my name is Wintry Knight. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Knight and Rose Show, which is a podcast about Christian worldview and apologetics. And our guest today is Seth Dillon. Seth is the CEO of the Babylon Bee, the world's most trusted, factually accurate news source. Today, we'll be asking Seth some questions about mockery and the art of making a case for the Christian worldview. Seth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here, man. Is that your legal name, Wintry Knight?
It's my alias. It served me well over the years. I was going through the legal immigration process. The worst thing that you want to avoid in that case is getting deported. You lose your job while you're on a work permit and you get deported. So we did not want that.
I'm trying to remember how many years ago I came across your blog initially. When did you start your blog?
I started my blog in 2009. Yeah, it's still going. Although if you're like me, you probably are running into problems with being kind of deplatformed by big social media.
We've had a few issues with that.
Yes, indeed. Oh, okay. Rose is here. So,
hey, Rose.
Hello, I am here.
Very good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with the questions. We have a lot of questions, and then we really are curious to find out what you think about all these things. So the first question is, you're the CEO of the Babylon Bee. What caused you to, or inspired you, I should say, to invest in the Babylon Bee? And why do you think it's become so influential?
Well, in terms of what I didn't want to invest in the Bee initially. That wasn't what I wanted to do. I didn't want to own it, I guess I should say. I wanted to invest in it. I didn't want to actually buy it and acquire it and own it and run it because I had no idea what I was doing when it came to running a media site. I had never done it before. I just thought it was a really amazing thing to see Christians doing comedy in a way that wasn't cheesy. It was actually effective. It was going viral. It was getting attention. It's so refreshing and rare to see that. So when I first started seeing headlines like Holy Spirit unable to move through congregation as fog machine breaks, that kind of stuff coming across my Facebook feed, and it was getting a lot of traction and engagement, I thought to myself, man, this is really cool. I wish I had started this site. And so with very little hesitation, I almost immediately reached out to the founder of the Bee, Adam, who you may be familiar with. Do you know Adam?
Yes, I do.
Yep.
Yeah, Adam's a really great guy. He's a really good friend of mine now. I didn't know him at all. Initially, I just reached out and I said, hey, what you've got is awesome. Looks like you're just running like a simple WordPress blog right now. And I'm interested in seeing if there's ways we can partner to try to grow this thing. Do you need funding? What do you need? How can I help? He didn't really have any reason to know me either because I hadn't become any kind of a public personality yet. That didn't happen until I owned the Bee. So he was a little wary about who I was and whether he could trust me. And he was in the middle of working out a deal with the Daily Wire at the time. They were trying to acquire the Bee. And,
wow.
They ended up backing out of that deal largely because of Facebook censorship and their concern with having another platform that had all its eggs in Facebook's basket. That's where Babylon Bee got all of its traffic from. So, they backed out of that deal, and Adam called me back a month later or so and was like, hey, if you want to come to Michigan and meet me, we can sit down and talk and see if we can work something out. But I don't want an investor. I want a buyer. I want to sell this thing. So This was 2 years into the Bee's life. He started it in early 2016. He and I met in 2018, start of 2018. And we hit it off. We argued and debated Calvinism and talked about how we converted to Christianity and when, and told our life stories and ended up kind of hitting it off and working out a deal. So that's the story of how I got involved in the Bee initially. But at the time, there was just 2 other people involved working on the site, like actually as their job. So it was a very, very small operation, and we built it all from there.
Wow.
Yes, indeed. And I think it was a great idea because the way that the culture is going, it's sometimes hard to engage some of the challenges that we face. But Mockery seems to have provided us, with a tool for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, an effective tool, I think.
Yeah, I think so. So I have a question. I have some friends who utilize Mockery and Sarcasm in various areas of ministry, and they are frequently, they say they spend probably half their time defending their use of Mockery to Christians in particular. But I'm wondering, have you experienced criticism for using Mockery and Sarcasm to promote your ideas?
Yeah, it's not like we're just getting bombarded with criticism over it, but it is a common criticism. I'd say it's one of the most common criticisms. We get hate mail and negative feedback for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes when we make a political joke and, it steps on somebody's toes or makes them uncomfortable. Mockery, though, it's something that a lot of Christians find objectionable because what they see in the Bee, you'll find this all over the place. There's a lot of YouTube commentary on the Babylon Bee, how we're mean and cruel and we're making fun of things that shouldn't be made fun of or made light of, and it's not being done in the right spirit, and it's not beneficial, it's not helpful, etc. Mm-hmm. So we get a lot of that. A lot of people challenging us and saying, how can you sleep at night when you're mocking people for a living? And I guess on the one hand, and I do think a lot of Christians feel pressure to think in those terms because we have so much cultural influence right now telling us that we need to be tolerant and compassionate. And
Yes.
that means when something comes across our field of vision or comes into our world that we disagree with, the response is not to speak the truth, even in love. It's to be affirming and tolerant of whatever it is, even if it's really, really, really bad for some reason. And I couldn't disagree with that more strongly. I don't think it's loving at all to affirm someone when they're wrong, especially about who and what they are, whether or not they're, made in God's image as a man or a woman, for example, with this whole transgender stuff. Like there's a lot of issues where the loving thing to do is to speak the truth and to expose the bad ideas that need to be torn down before they gain a lot of traction and are taken seriously. I think it's catastrophic when bad ideas are taken seriously. And the best illustration of that is these teenagers right now who are regretting their gender transition surgeries. I mean, why did they have it in the first place? Because we took bad ideas seriously. They believed that they were a girl trapped in a boy's body. That's not even possible. To be a girl is to have a girl's body. That's what it means to be a girl. So, speaking the truth is, I think, a loving thing, even if it's uncomfortable. I think the truth is highly offensive. Your goal should never be to not be offensive. I don't think that we should be, just tearing people down and making them feel bad about themselves on purpose. But the purpose of our mockery, what we're doing with satire, I think that the mission of the satirist, especially the religious satirist, is to take a scalp to these social cancers and cut them out before they kill the host. And so I think you are cutting people, but not for the purpose of wounding them and hurting them. It's for a healing purpose.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, both Rose and I come at Christianity from non-Christian backgrounds. So we kind of compare what we read in the Bible and with what we see in the church. And we often find these differences. A lot of times in the church, especially today, there's this great concern about what will the non-Christians think of me? And boy, I really hope that they notice that I'm signaling virtue right now. But let me ask you another question related to this. So do you think that like according to the Bible, like that Christians should find mockery to be a useful tool?
Well, I mean, you do see examples of it in the Bible. I think the Bible is filled with a lot of scathing rebukes and hyperbole and sarcasm. There are some specific examples of, mocking absurdity in the Bible. And so I don't think that if you point, you can certainly point to passages too where it talks about being gentle in how you approach people and exercising the fruits of the Spirit and all of those things. But there is a time and a place for confronting people with harsh truths or exposing the hypocrisy or absurdity of their position. And I think, you see that with Elijah, you see that with Jesus himself. He had a number of scathing rebukes for people. He talked about how it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. He was brutal in the way he addressed these things, and he used, parables and this kind of imagery to kind of draw these things out. And, some will say that, well, you're not a prophet, you're not Jesus. So, you can't have that kind of, who are you to take that approach? I just think that the Bible does establish that these are effective means of communicating truths in powerful ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. You actually mentioned the two examples that I use the most frequently when this comes up in conversations with people, Elijah. And then of course, when they say, well, what if Elijah was wrong or whatever? And I point to Jesus, but
Elijah was funny. I mean, he's actually funny. He's challenging these prophets by suggesting, well, maybe their God is off relieving himself somewhere, or taking a nap, and needs to be awakened. It's like he's being like witty and exercising humor in tearing down, what their false beliefs. And I think it's extreme. It's a powerful passage.
It really is. It's absolutely hilarious. And he's doing it with the purpose of demonstrating the truth to people. And what he's drawing people away from are ideas that are not all that unlike this whole transgender movement that you mentioned. I mean, these false prophets were cutting themselves, and the 1 Kings 18 talks about how they were bleeding all over the place because they were cutting themselves as they were dancing around, yelling, screaming, and cutting, calling on their false gods. And so that's not healthy. And so he starts just mocking this horrible idea, and in a hilarious and powerful, memorable way, to point people to the truth. And I love that. I think that's what the Babylon Bee does. I absolutely love you guys.
Yeah, and I think there's a great quote that I throw out all the time. It's not the first time I'm quoting it, but G.K. Chesterton said that humor can get in under the door while seriousness is still fumbling at the handle. And I think it's a great way of putting it, because what he's trying to communicate there is that humor it's disarming, and it is memorable. It makes a point in a creative way that causes you to stop and think, rather than someone just, trying to beat you over the head with logic and reason and facts and whatever. It's a more disarming way of delivering the package of truth.
Yeah.
And by the way, I do think it's very difficult to reason with people, to argue and reason with people who have abandoned rationality intentionally. Like they've thrown it out the window and they're trying to say that 2 and 2 make 5. Well, you're not really going to make a lot of headway reasoning with people who've given up on reason on purpose. So, but what you can do is ridicule their bad ideas so that other people don't take them seriously.
Right. I also, something that's occurring to me now is I also appreciate how you kind of help us laugh at ourselves as well. There have been several times where I read, about things that I've seen or even done in the church, and taken with a bit of exaggeration or humor or whatever. It's good to be able to laugh at ourselves. If we take ourselves too seriously as well, you guys don't just criticize bad ideas, but you kind of, make light of some things that are a little bit humorous about, the way we maybe do church or some things like that. And I think that's really healthy to be able to take our, to kind of take a step back and just have some humor about ourselves. We have to have humor in this world that is so serious and oftentimes dark and scary.
Well, it's an important point. I mean, look at how culture shifted just in the last decade or so. You now have stand-up comedians who are afraid that people are going to charge the stage and punch them if they make a joke that's offensive. Like, there's this new expectation that everybody has the right to not be offended, and that we all deserve to live in a little safe space where our feelings will never be hurt. And this extends to the world of humor and comedy. People used to be able to sit there in an audience while a stand-up comedian was on stage, laughing at them and pointing out absurdities about them in the audience, and they would laugh at themselves, and they were willing to laugh at themselves, and they were willing to make jokes about the opposite sex and stereotypes and things of that nature, because it's a healthy way of examining ourselves and recognizing and acknowledging our own faults and our own shortcomings and our own hypocrisy. Like, that is a valuable thing in growing your character. If you never engage in that exercise and you're completely unwilling to ever laugh at yourself, and you take yourself that seriously, you'll never build resilience of character. You'll always be hypersensitive. Everything will always trigger you. And then you end up in therapy sessions for the rest of your life, crying and then dyeing your hair blue and then changing your gender.
Exactly.
Yeah. It would be really nice if Christian leaders and Christians even in the pews just understood the advantage that we can offer to non-Christians by giving them a safe place to joke about these things and talk about these things.
Yeah. And it can't be overstated. I mean, we are all passengers on the ship of fools from time to time. And so I think it's very healthy. Especially the church needs levity too. The church needs to be willing to laugh at itself and take itself less seriously. I think it's part of the reason why the Bee was so successful right out the gate, is because it was willing to do that. And there were still enough people in the church who were willing to say, look, this is funny. It's making fun of us, but it's funny. It's self-deprecating. And that's a good thing. It's okay to laugh at ourselves. In fact, it's a lot worse if we're taking ourselves so seriously that every little thing offends us.
Yeah. Right. Let me ask you a question. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Many of the people I've noticed who oppose Mockery also oppose the use of evidence when defending the claims of Christianity. I noticed that recently you tweeted out a list of scientific evidences for a creator and designer, and many of those evidences were based on recent scientific discoveries. So I just want to ask you, do you think that the progress of science has made theism a better description of reality than atheism?
In a word, yes. There's what year was it the Time came out with a cover that said God is dead?
Something like the low 1980s, I want to say.
It's a while ago, yeah. But that was kind of like, it was becoming a popular idea that science had buried God, that science had put the last nail in God's coffin because it had explained so many intractable problems. And when I look at the scientific evidence, especially the evidence of the 20th century and even more recently, the problems that we're looking at here, like how did the universe begin? Where did life come from? How did consciousness arise from unconscious matter? What's the origin of the information in DNA? Like, all of these problems. Why are there moral truths? Why are there moral duties and values? Like, all of these problems, the majority of them, not all of them, because I don't think morality necessarily plays into this bit of the conversation, but most of these issues have only become more intractable as science has advanced. And by that, I mean, like, for example, with the problem of the origin of life and DNA and information, Steve Meyer does an excellent job of illustrating this problem. as we have learned how life, what is necessary, the building blocks for life to arise, as we've learned how complex that is. And it's not just complexity, there's specified complexity involved there in the information content of the DNA molecule, these instructions for building, body plans, and all of these things have been uncovered as science has advanced. And we've learned that there's language. The most advanced and impressive software code ever written is at the core of life itself. Yep. And so when science uncovers that and opens up that box, we see something that it was much easier to believe in the past that somehow there was some, primordial ooze that life arose out of when we didn't understand exactly what was required for life in the first place. But now that we do, we realize that this is a much bigger problem than we thought. And so I think that also happens when it's also an issue when you look at the universe itself, how it came to exist, how it came to be fine-tuned. So much of what we've learned as physics and astronomy have advanced is that these problems are far greater than we originally thought. It's not true that the universe just always existed and it's just a brute fact that we have to deal with. It came to exist at a finite point in the past, and we have to deal with that. And so I think the advances of science have only made it more clear that naturalistic explanations for these phenomena are insufficient. The gaps are the chasms are too wide to be bridged, even by allowing for extended periods of time.
Yeah, definitely. The more discoveries we make in these areas that you mentioned, the more it is a challenge to the worldview of naturalism. And for people who maybe haven't heard of all the areas that you were talking about, you did a great job. And that guy that you mentioned, Stephen C. Meyer, he's my favorite on these topics.
Yeah, he's great. He just had an amazing interview with Joe Rogan recently too. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to watch that yet, but
yes,
he got into a lot of this with Rogan, and it was a really great conversation.
Yeah, it's great
it was excellent.
It's great when these things get into sort of more mainstream forums like that. I texted that to all of my neighbors. I posted that in our company Slack, and got a lot of likes. Like, I think if people aren't aware of when these things are happening, it's probably good to plug yourself in, and so that that these things are happening, and then you can share it with all of your family and friends. Because that's the way I think we're going to change minds, is by having someone who knows about these things have conversations with more mainstream people, where we don't come across as fundamentalists, but instead we're saying, hey, these are the discoveries and the facts that we're looking at, and here's how our views are changing to adapt to how we know the real world works.
I was just going to say, and I think Christians can take a cue from Stephen Meyer as well, in the way that he was able to explain his beliefs without sounding like a fundamentalist. We don't have to sound like a fundamentalist. We don't have to just quote Bible verses and say that we have this blind faith or whatever. There are such good reasons, as we've been talking about, and so I would just love to see more Christians able to communicate that, even if they're not able to do it in the same type of with the same type of depth and complexity and excellence as Stephen Meyer. There are a few pretty straightforward, simple arguments that we can all be.
Yeah, that's true. It's tough to match him in terms of how articulate and knowledgeable he is. But when he does emphasize, I think this is an important point, which a lot of people miss. But what the kind of reasoning that he's employing with his arguments is standard scientific reasoning. He's making an inference to the best explanation based on what we know. Mm-hmm. And so he's not making claims with certainty. He's not appealing to blind faith. He's saying, these things are best explained, for example, by intelligence rather than some unintelligent source. And that's just, if you're dedicated and committed to waiting for some other answer to come along, and you're never willing to say, well, based on what we know, this is an inference to the best explanation, it must be intelligence. If you're committed to some kind of a naturalistic explanation and say, well, I'm going to wait until we have that naturalistic explanation, well, then you're just begging the question in favor of naturalism. You're not following the evidence where it's currently pointing.
I think everybody has a responsibility to construct their worldview based on what we know right now.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And what we know right now tends to favor a creative design.
That's a very important.
Anyway, that is another question
point too, because that is a frequent response. Is that, well, I'm confident that there will be, because they will say science has been so successful at explaining things in the past. We used to think thunder was gods bowling in the sky or something like that. And science has disproved that. It will eventually disprove everything. Well, that's a blind faith in science. You've got these unbridgeable chasms that keep getting wider, and you just keep digging in harder with your faith in science. You're not following the evidence where it currently leads. Yeah,
it's funny to me how frequently someone will accuse me right out of the gates of just believing in God because of a God of the gaps That's the phrase that I like to use. This God of the gaps. You're just putting God wherever there are gaps. Anything you don't understand, you just attribute to God. And then I'll explain scientific evidence that led me to conclude that the best explanation for the scientific evidence is a designer and creator with intelligence. And before long, I'm hearing what you just said. One day science will discover it and figure it out. Well, that's a science of the gaps argument.
Exactly.
You are now doing what you accused me of 30 seconds ago.
Yeah, it's a fallacy.
Definitely. So related to that method of reasoning that you talked about, I think it's called abductive reasoning, where you go for the best explanation of the facts that everyone accepts. There's another place in Christian apologetics where we do that. So I think it's good to start with the scientific evidence for a creator and designer that we went over. But it's helpful because it gets us to the point where we have a supernatural being who can then perform miracles. And I think this is important because Christianity, the truth of Christianity in particular, as opposed to the other monotheistic religions like Judaism and Islam, kind of hangs on historical miracles, such as the resurrection. So, Seth, how would you argue for the resurrection with someone who didn't accept the Bible as inspired or inerrant?
I definitely don't think. In fact, it'd be hard for me to think of somebody. Can you think of somebody who argues for the resurrection on the basis of the fact that the Bible is inerrant? I don't think that that's usually part of the argument, right? They're usually examining it by saying that these are the historical facts and the Bible's reliable. It's a reliable witness to what the facts are, but they're not hinging it on inerrancy, for example.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
So, I think, the evidence for the fact that there was an empty tomb and the postmortem appearances and the origin of the Christian faith, when there was, all kinds of reasons why, if this was just a legend or a fabrication, that none of this would have happened. I think that you can establish lines of evidence using the New Testament documents as just historical documents that are reliable when it comes to establishing these facts. I don't think that you have to try to convince anybody first. Oh, well, let's start. I think it'd be very foolish to try to suggest that, you have to prove inerrancy first before you can get to those things. I think if we can at least agree that these are reliable historical documents. So I think you have more, your work is really cut out for you in suggesting or showing that the Gospels themselves are reliable. I think a lot of people have come to believe that Jesus, for example, didn't even necessarily exist. And so, you're going to have some of those conversations first, some groundwork for suggesting that the New Testament itself is reliable.
I think I love Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, William Lane Craig on this one because they use what is known as the minimal facts argument. And so, they'll talk about how scholars of all different worldviews, historians of every different religion, worldview, background, faith commitment, agree to several, there are actually several dozen, but you can make the case using just like 4 of facts that virtually all historians agree to. And you mentioned some of them. The ones I like to use are just because they're so solid and so universally accepted. Said that Jesus was crucified.
Yeah.
Okay, you're going to be hard pressed to find someone who thinks that Jesus wasn't crucified if there's a historian who has actually studied the evidence. Muslims aren't going to buy into that if they just blindly believe the Quran. But anybody who's studied the historical evidence is going to agree to that. People of all different worldviews and backgrounds who are historians of the evidence are going to tell you that the disciples of Jesus believed they saw him appear alive after his crucifixion. So they may not believe that he actually appeared to them, but they're going to admit that they thought the disciples believed that Jesus appeared to them. They're going to admit to you that the skeptics, James, the brother of Jesus, and the enemy of Christianity, Saul of Tarsus, ended up becoming followers of Jesus because of something they saw, something that happened. And they're going to agree that the message of the crucifixion and the resurrection was preached very, very early, within at least a couple years of the crucifixion, of the events themselves. And just, with these facts that virtually everybody agrees to, we can ask the question, just like we did with science, just like you were talking about Stephen Meyer, what is the best case? What is the best explanation for this evidence? All of the thoughts and ideas that have been proposed have been refuted by atheists themselves, by agnostics, by non-Christians. Things like hallucinations, or Jesus had a twin, or he didn't really die. All of these things are just ridiculous and have been successfully refuted. And so I actually love sharing the minimal facts argument that kind of goes right back to that same idea. What's the best explanation for the facts?
Back to something you said, Seth, about first-person consciousness and objective moral standards, objective moral duties. You said that you run into non-Christians who kind of help themselves to these ideas. How do you approach, countering them or on those topics?
On topics like consciousness, morality, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, those kinds of things, free will, even human rights.
Well, this is where I love C.S. Lewis's approach to the question of miracles, and in his book Miracles, where he starts out talking about we need to determine whether or not miracles are even possible. What kind of worldview makes the most sense? And he starts analyzing naturalism versus supernaturalism and weighing them against each other. And some of the problems that he points out with naturalism, which is just this worldview that nature is all that exists, that is this closed system, there's nothing beyond it, nothing transcendent, there are no supernatural beings or whatever. He starts highlighting some of the problems of naturalism, and I think this is actually he offers my favorite argument. It's my favorite apologetic argument, is the argument from reason, where he talks about how if the universe is this closed system where everything reduces to physics and chemistry, and every cause has an effect, and if you trace all of the current events back to the beginning, each of them had a cause before that, and a cause before that, and a cause before that. In that environment, there's really just at bottom physical causes and effects that account for everything. And there's no room for things like reason and morality at all. And he shows how naturalism is self-defeating by showing that if naturalism is true, then we've undercut reason itself, which is what we would have to rely on in order to arrive at the conclusion that naturalism is true. And it's such a powerful argument because it literally gets behind and around every other argument that we could have. But it's important because it kind of lays the groundwork for that question that you're talking about, how you answer those types of questions. There are these things, people take it for granted that they can think, that they can draw inferences, that they can reach conclusions. Everybody tries to argue with you. Atheists try to argue with you, metaphysical naturalists will try to convince you of their position, even as they're denying that such a thing as rational inference, like logical insight into what a conclusion could be following from premises, like that has no causal power on their worldview. It's all things happening underneath the surface. It's the changes that are happening in your brain. The entire history of the universe explains the current mental state that you're in. And so how can you even trust your brain to reach logical conclusions? It undermines all of that. And so I love the way that I think it's Geisler and Turek put it, this is stealing from God.
Yep.
These ideas that we can establish moral facts, or that we can reason and rely on our rational inference, all of that requires that a worldview other than naturalism is true. You have to affirm some other worldview in order to get these things. And so I think that's extremely powerful. And it's my favorite argument, the argument from reason. I think the moral argument is probably the most powerful and convincing because, everybody has moral objections to things, and they may suggest that there's some kind of relativistic framework that we should all buy into, but they will try to apply their morality to you as if it's some kind of objective standard. And they'll make excuses for whenever they do something that they think violates the moral law. And so because we all have this innate moral sense, and so many of our positions and so many of these arguments hinge on moral issues, I think the moral argument is maybe the most impactful. But I think the argument from reason addresses a lot of those things.
Well, I just want to make one comment. I think it's also interesting that probably the most common objection to Christianity that apologists tend to hear today is an objection from evil. Like if there is such how could a good and loving and powerful God allow such evil? And yet this comes back to, your question, well, what makes you think there's such a thing as evil? Why would you call something evil? Why don't you is that your opinion? Where'd you get that from? Where's that come from?
I think that evil, if there is such a thing as evil, then it's proof that God exists, because you can't call something evil unless there's a standard of good to compare it with. And on metaphysical naturalism, I see no reason to think that properties like good or bad or evil should attach themselves to anything that happens. It's all just a bunch of at bottom, these physical events. And a lot of atheists acknowledge that. It's the Richard Dawkins talking about how the universe is just, we're all dancing to the tune of our DNA, and it's all just blind, pitiless indifference, and there is no real good or evil. He, at the same time, has all kinds of moral positions that and he will offer his own scathing rebukes of anybody who disagrees with his moral positions. But that is really an entailment. I think it's an entailment of naturalism or atheism, is that there really is no moral realm like that. Any moral beliefs that we have about what's really good and bad are illusory. if that
Right.
worldview is true. And so, to have objections to Christianity and say, oh, well, there's evil and suffering in the world. I think the only way it's possible for there to be evil in the world is if something like Christianity is true. And by the way, it offers an answer to that problem.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
Very good. All right. So let me ask you this question. So you are a person who has applied your Christian worldview to a large number of different topics. You've talked about them tonight. You talked about transgenderism. I know that you're very articulate on the pro-life issue. So there's probably a long list of these areas. Some of them policy, some of them moral, some of them cultural, that you've kind of applied Christianity to, and you've come up with different views. And I was just wondering, do you think that that's an important thing for Christians to do? And why is it so important for you? Why have you done this? And do you think that it's part of the normal Christian life?
Yeah, when you're talking about these kinds of issues, you can't really check your worldview at the door. Your worldview is going to come to bear on what you think about them and why you think these things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot to say right now about family and relationships and sexuality and marriage and the sanctity of life and the whole concept of social justice and all of these things that we're debating and talking about. And much of it, to go back to the previous topic that we were just talking about on the issue of morality, much of this has to do with morality. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I think that we can agree with some people who may disagree with us on religion side of things, Christianity in particular, is that we do want humanity to flourish, and we don't want bad things to be happening to people. We want people to be happy and healthy, and we want to reduce suffering. What are the best solutions to lead to human flourishing? Well, in order to come up with that, you really have to understand what the root problem is. What are we trying to treat? What problem are we trying to treat? And a lot of what we're trying to treat is the effects of sin. So I think a Christian worldview can't be checked at the door when you're trying to deal with problems that are rooted in sin and evil. And you've got to address what the biblical solution is to those things. And I think it's reasonable and rational to do that. And you're on good footing when it comes to, though, issues like pro-life is a good example, because that's something that I talk about very frequently. You don't have to appeal to your Bible to make that case. You can, but you certainly don't have to. There are arguments that you can make. You can refer to common sense. You can refer to science, and you can point out the horrible logical errors and flaws and fallacies in the other side's reasoning without ever referring to your Christianity or the Bible. But Christians, I think, absolutely have an obligation to, and I think it's indispensable. There's no way around it. You're going to bring your worldview to these topics.
Yeah, I love that you use the word worldview. Because as you said, Christianity it applies to every single area of our lives. It's not something we do on Sunday morning. It's not just some series of rituals or whatever. But our view of Christianity, that I believe is entirely biblical, is God is the boss. He has views about every area of knowledge. When Jesus was on earth, he was focused on obeying the Father in everything, and he experienced suffering while doing that. And it's our job now as God's ambassadors, as Christ's ambassadors on this earth, to understand his interests, to champion his interests in all of these different areas, and to have a comprehensive Christian worldview that applies to absolutely every area, whether we're talking about science, morality, free speech, economics, any of these things. I love how you model that in your life.
Thank you.
So.
Well, I mean, it comes down to speaking the truth, because you tell the truth to people that you love. And one of the ways of I think it's a lot more important, loving your neighbor. They'll tell you that the way to love your neighbor is to wear a mask and social distance and get vaccinated. Some Christians will tell you that's the way to love your neighbor, but I think there are much more dire things that we need to be worried about, and a lot of that, in a lot of the way that you love your neighbor through those things is by speaking the truth. Absolutely. 2 and 2 do not make 5. Men cannot become women. You can't be a girl trapped in a boy's body. Our culture is cultivating confusion, and then once that confusion sets in, we're treating it with affirmation, and it's just absolutely insane. It deserves mockery. It deserves ridicule. It needs to be confronted with the truth, and so I think it's vitally important.
Yeah, I think it's so contrary. What you've communicated and what we believe is so contrary to where I think most of Christian culture seems to be today, which is that Christianity is all about making them feel happy and comfortable and popular, making their own plans, whatever those may be, work out, making them, materially wealthy right now and comfortable, and just giving them kind of everything they want. And I think that it's not a coincidence then that when things don't go easily and smoothly in a fallen world, shocker, that, then people are like, how could God exist when something's hard in my life?
Right.
And yet, I think that all of those objections even are just stemming from a false worldview.
Man, it feels to me like
a
lot of that is like there's so many Christians who haven't actually picked up and read their Bibles. How can you read the Bible and think that Christians are supposed to have it easy?
Right. Exactly.
It's really difficult to do. And there's actually overlap. I think there's overlap with that in the secular world's kind of obsession right now with this safe space mentality that we're supposed to be, comfortable and insulated from things that could hurt our feelings or hurt us. I don't think that we benefit from that. In fact, the Christian teaching is that, our character is built through these challenges. It draws us, it can draw, if we allow it to, it can draw us closer to God and make us better people. Look at a story like Corrie ten Boom and the suffering that she went through in concentration camps, and how her faith remained like firm and unshaken in that. And then the life that she was able to lead after that, and the people that she was able to influence with her message. I mean, that's just profound. She suffered unimaginably. So, the expectation that we're supposed to be happy or healthy and wealthy if we place our trust in God or something is just so wildly and insanely unbiblical. Obviously, there is ultimately in the end going to be, every tear will be wiped away and there will be joy and restoration and redemption, but not necessarily in this life.
Right, exactly.
Let me ask you a follow-up question about that. So mentioning Corrie ten Boom, she was somebody who lived, in a very difficult time, a difficult period in Germany that was not at all friendly to Christians. I was just going to, we've been talking a lot tonight about the use of mockery and evidential apologetics. And I've noticed lately in the culture that we're seeing a lot of weaponization of government against Christians and conservatives. And I was just wondering if you thought that there was some sort of role for Christians to use mockery and evidential apologetics to kind of counter the confidence that the secular left has in attacking our rights, attacking our freedoms.
All right. Well, let's get a little more specific. What are some examples that you're thinking of? Are you thinking of people who are like protesters at an abortion clinic who get arrested or something like that, like government overreach? And
getting pre-done raided by the FBI, peaceful protesters.
Right, or pastors refusing to shut down their churches and facing penalties and things like that.
That happened a lot in Canada. And as well, what about the parents at the school board meeting saying, I have an interest in how my kids are educated, and then having the Department of Justice and the school boards kind of collude to label them as domestic terrorists?
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff.
We've brought mockery to bear on those issues. But I honestly, I think the most powerful thing in those cases are the people who refuse to bend the knee and remain firm in their conviction. They have not just the Constitution on their side. They're basically embolden other people, I think, when they actually have a backbone and they stand up. And that will have the biggest impact on actually changing things, because the more people stand up and the more they get a backbone and the more they refuse to comply, as we say on Twitter or X, I gotta say X, do not comply, do not comply. I think that's absolutely necessary. I think a lot of Christians have shown that they're willing to, kind of defy those orders, especially when it comes to the practice of their religious freedom. And without that willingness, if they're really just kind of passive and allow themselves to be trampled on, that just gives the people in power all the more power. So the important thing, I don't know how effective mockery is in that case. I mean, we do make jokes about that kind of stuff, but the biggest thing is just to be bold and to stand up against it, even if it means it's going to cost you something. It's the weirdest thing to me when people act like they're courageous right up until it costs them something, which isn't actually courage at all. You're only courageous if you're willing to pay a price for what you're doing, if you're putting yourself at risk, and that courage is contagious. It really is.
It is, and it has been from the beginning. I think of the Apostle Paul talking about how his being in chains was emboldening the brothers and sisters in Christ, causing them to go out and be bolder in their faith and to speak the truth. And we've seen that all throughout church history. And we Tertullian is known for saying the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. What we've always seen, even when it's not that extreme, that blood is drawn, is that when Christians are willing to stand up for truth, for their convictions, that it emboldens other people.
It does. And you know what? It can have an impact. I mean, in our case, I would never say that we're persecuted in the way that a lot of other Christians are persecuted. But we have faced these challenges where, for example, when we made that joke about Rachel Levine and referred to Rachel Levine as our pick for Man of the Year, which was misgendering and hateful conduct, right. They wanted us to delete that. And our position was, well, first, this is a joke, right? It's just a satire. Second of all, it's
Right.
true. Rachel Levine is in fact a man. The definition of man is a male human being. So it's true, and it's funny. So why would we delete it? It's ridiculous. So we refused to delete it, even though it meant that we wouldn't get our Twitter account back. And as far as we knew, we would never get our Twitter account back. We would remain in Twitter jail forever,
Right.
unless and until the
Right.
richest man in the world came along and bought it and said, no, I'm going to restore the Babylon Bee. And that happened to happen. But we couldn't hope for that. We couldn't expect that. We didn't plan for that. We just stood on our conviction that it wasn't the right thing to bend the knee to the tyrants who want to try to control what you're allowed to say and think, and that you can't say that 2 and 2 make 4. They want you to say 2 and 2 make 5. So, I mean, taking a stand like that, even though it's a situation where, well, it's just our Twitter account, it's not like we weren't being tossed in prison. We were just being tossed in Twitter jail, which is it inconvenient? Is it costly for our business? Is it a bad thing? Sure. But, being committed to speaking the truth in those cases where it costs you something does embolden other people, and it can actually facilitate change. So
Absolutely.
I think we are at least an example of that.
Yeah. So this will be my last question then related to this. What sort of pressure or persecution do you foresee for people who do take following Jesus seriously? And I think for you in particular, what do you see coming down the pipe in terms of challenges to you and your company?
I mean, probably just more of what we've already experienced. There's a very serious cultural war going on right now. There is a war on reality, reason, and truth. And so anybody who's willing to speak it is going to be a target, especially if you have a large audience and you're doing it effectively. They'll do anything they can to tear you down and smear you and deplatform you and silence you if they can. So I think that's really the primary threat right now that people like us face is having our reach or our voice in some way limited or silenced because we're saying things that we're not supposed to be saying. And that's just what does it communicate about how secure they are in their position that they can only silence the people they disagree with instead of actually engaging with their points. Exactly. Or just laughing off their jokes and saying, oh, well, I don't think that joke is, I don't even think that's that funny. Just don't laugh at it. Why do you have to silence the person who made the joke? Are you really that threatened by it? I think it conveys a lot of insecurity, but that's the main thing. I mean, the word persecution is very strong. I'm not sure I would necessarily use that word for a lot of what is happening here, but it does apply in some cases for sure.
It's definitely a case where I think the normal Christian life has to have some measure of disapproval for those people who take Christianity seriously and speak its truths and defend it.
Yeah, and no one should be discouraged by that. I don't think that anybody, I'm certainly not discouraged by the fact that people are attacking me. In fact, I say this, if the New York Times or, these the heads of these big tech companies that are cracking down on misinformation, hate speech or whatever, if they liked me, then I would be concerned. The fact that they're attacking me means I must be doing something right.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that if our generation is so uncomfortable with the absence of approval, if we're so uncomfortable with disapproval, if we're so scared of being, put in Twitter jail that we're willing to be silenced, if we're willing to just hide in our homes and say, okay, we won't say anything, we won't do anything anymore, we'll take down our blogs, we'll do this, we'll do that. The next generation, our children, are going to be the ones who experience real persecution.
I agree.
So we can pay a small price right now, or they can pay a huge price.
Right. And people will say, that's not fair. That's not fair. Especially when I talk about the women's sports issue and I say, you know what? Women need to be willing to give up their sports to keep them. And what I mean by that is they have to say no to this stuff. They have to refuse to compete with men. When a man jumps in the pool, you don't jump in the pool. Don't swim against him. Wait until the men are gone and then swim against other women. And that might mean that you have to sack some championships. It might mean that you're off the team for a while. It might mean that you never play again or compete again. Yep. But if you're not willing to take those kinds of measures and actually have it cost you something, then nothing will change. You can't. That's the way to solve these problems. It's the best and quickest way to solve these problems is by being willing to make that kind of a sacrifice. And I never argued that it was fair, but I will say that it's necessary. And that's a crucial distinction to make. We're not asking anybody to do something that's fair or easy. Speaking the truth when it has consequences, for example, is not the easy thing to do, but it's often the right thing to do. And, there's a lot to be said for the fact that I think, people ask all the time, like, how can we help with these situations where we're being censored or deplatformed or whatever? What can I do to help? Should I subscribe? And no, just speak the truth boldly. Because if you don't do that, if we don't have lots of people doing that, then everyone who does is an outlier and they're easy to squash. If there's millions of us doing it, then they lose all their power. We can take it away from them. We only give them more power. When we censor ourselves, we're doing the tyrant's work for him. We have to stop doing that.
Absolutely. Yeah, well said.
Definitely. That's a great thought for us to end on. Seth Dillon, thank you so much for talking today about mockery and apologetic. Listeners, if you enjoyed our discussion today, we would just encourage you to check out the Knight and Rose Show. That's KNIGHT and Rose Show, a podcast where Rose and I discuss how to help Christians develop their worldview and how to make a case for Christianity using evidence. We hope we'll see you there.